evening.
Good evening.
When we were about to have our second child, I felt sorry for our first. She had been the center of our world for 3 years, and now she would have to share our love with a newcomer. And I thought that our love was a finite resource. What a delightful surprise was waiting for us. We wouldn't have to divide up our love by which daughter was the better student, by which cleaned her room more faithfully. We had enough love for both of them abundantly. You know, sometimes we make the same mistake about God's love. We think it's finite also. It's also common sense that when we have a limited resource, we're careful about how much we give away. A big share for the deserving, a small share for the undeserving, and no share for the bad people. We think it seems silly when we say it out loud. We think as if God's love is sold by auction. It's going to the highest bidder. That's why Jesus told this story of the publican and the Pharisee. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee strode to the front and apart from all the others. Some of them he knew well were sinners. He stood tall, head up. "Oh God, thank you that I am not like other men. I am not an extortionist, not an unjust man, not an adulterer. God, I thank you, I am in no way like that tax collector over there. I fast for 2 days every week. I give tithes not only on what I earn, but also on what I purchase." This is how the Pharisee prayed to God, almost one equal to another. While the second man crept to a corner of the temple apart from all the other worshipers, shoulders bent, head heavy on his chest. He was a broken, empty vessel. The words he had planned that night before had fallen from his mind. He whispered, "Lord, have mercy on me." Jesus said, "Listen to my words. 2 men walked from the temple, but only one walked in the light of the Lord. For the sinner was made right with God, but the holy man left as he had entered." What did Jesus mean? Why did he praise the sinner's prayer over the holy man's prayer? We think this story is about pride and humility because we've forgotten what the people who first heard the story would have understood. The Pharisee should have been proud. The tax collector should have been humble. This is why. In Jesus' time, there was a saying that if only 2 men could be saved, one of them would surely be a Pharisee. Most of the criticism about Pharisees in the Christian scriptures was inserted later when the Apostle Paul and the gospel writers were trying to distance their Christian experience from Hebrew tradition. Pharisees were well respected in Jesus' time, and this Pharisee was a really good man. He followed not only the written law of his people, but its centuries of interpretation. The written law told the Jews to fast 1 day a year. The Pharisee fasted 2 days a week. The written law told the Jews to tithe 1/10 of everything they earned for the temple. The Pharisee also tithed on everything he brought, in case the man who sold it to him had evaded the tax. Do any of you volunteer to pay twice the tax? I certainly don't. But that's the kind of thing that this Pharisee did. He was the kind of member you'd want for our church. He'd be a greeter at the door, and he would simultaneously lead us in singing, lead us in worship, and he'd teach at Sunday school. He would give generously to the church, keep our church books, and wash our dishes. Make absolutely no mistake that this Pharisee was a very good man. And he was right about the tax collector also. The tax collector was just as bad a man as the Pharisee was good. They lived in a tight community, and they would have known each other just by reputation. The Pharisee might even know from personal experience just how bad that tax collector was. And here's why. The Roman Empire had virtually no civil servants. Remember, the business of a vast empire still had to get done, so they privatized it. Every year, Rome auctioned off contracts to build roads, to excavate mines, to feed legions, and to collect taxes. The closer a people lived to Rome and Rome's scrutiny, the fairer their tax rate was. The people of Palestine lived very far from Rome, and they routinely paid 2 and 3 times the legal tax rate. The man or company who held the contract scooped up the surplus as personal profit. Tax collectors made fantastic fortunes in the Middle East, and the people had no appeal. The army, courts, governor, they all shared in the spoil. And to add injury to insult, the people's taxes paid that same army, the courts, and the governor. The tax system was subcontracted into a pyramid scheme of exploitation. And the man who organized the local pyramid used bribes, blackmail, and inside knowledge of his own people against them. He handled unclean money, associated intimately with unclean Gentiles. He was so despicable, Jewish law forbade even a beggar to accept his charity. 2 men went to the temple to pray. One was the best of his people, one was the worst. One gave freely twice what the Lord commanded, one extorted twice what the law allowed. One fasted, one feasted. One lived in abstinence, and one lived in opulence. One raised his people up to God, the other crushed his people under his foot. Knowing what we know about them, we realize they each prayed exactly as they should have. One thanked God that he was a good man. The other couldn't do anything but beg for God's forgiveness. But the parables of Jesus are not about you and me. They're about the nature of God. And God's love is not a limited resource reserved for those who deserve it. He has more than enough for all who ask. The Pharisee didn't ask. The tax collector was so broken, that's all he could do. Is there hope for the tax collector? You remember Father Jim's story last week about the tax collector named Zacchaeus and how he was redeemed? Is there hope for the Pharisee? Of course there is. The Apostle Paul was a Pharisee before he set off down the road for Damascus. Later he preached his regret how his years of self-sufficiency had gotten in the way of his acceptance of God's grace. Is there hope for us? I sure hope so. God gives us the same love that he gives the sinner and the saint, and he knows that each and every one of us is a blend of both. But here's the good news. God's love is not a limited resource we have to bid the highest price for. We couldn't afford it anyway. It's our thinking we can, our sense of self-sufficiency that gets in the way of it reaching us. It's when we're broken, empty vessels, and the words we plan have fallen from our minds, we're most likely to hear God's voice. The Pharisee hadn't learned this yet. The tax collector had forgotten everything except that. My dear brothers and sisters, it is the human story that we each, sometimes in our lives, will enter into a night of grief or remorse. And it's exactly then that God's light will already be there. Our eyes at last will be able to see. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory.
Slava Jesus Christus.
Slava